The Anthony N. Sabga Awards Caribbean Excellence has been recognizing and supporting outstanding Caribbean nationals since 2006 in fields ranging from science and technology to public service. And we are pleased to profile them in this, our 4-part documentary series. In 2022, our Arts and Letters Laureate is none other than internationally acclaimed Jamaican author Marlon James, a writer still coming to grips with his literary celebrity.
You know, there's certain things I don't get to do anymore. Certain places I don't really get to go anymore, right? And you know, I'm not even famous. I'm like book famous. It's not like people are gonna run me down and grab my autograph. I wish writers got autographs. I get stalkers.
Marlon is at the top of his game, as recognizable and perhaps as famous as an author can be. In 2015, he won the world's most prestigious literary award, the Booker Prize, for his novel A Brief History of 7 Killings. And HBO recently filmed an entire television series about a Jamaican detective based on a story idea that he wrote on a napkin.
Yeah. Ooh. You sure you guys don't want to shoot this in some sort of shade?
At Hope Gardens in Kingston, on a very hot day in June, Marlon James is reflecting on the nature of literary celebrity. The Jamaican novelist, who lives and teaches in the United States, but is constantly in contact with other Caribbean writers, has written several New York Times bestsellers, and has been called, without question, the most important Caribbean novelist working today, and indeed one of the most important contemporary writers internationally. None other than the acclaimed Salman Rushdie has labeled him a writer who must be read. But perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story of the region's most celebrated contemporary fiction writer actually starts in suburban Jamaica in the 1980s.
You know, I grew up pretty middle class. I grew up in this neighborhood called Portmore, which is a suburb. The thing about growing up in the 80s in a suburb is if you grew up in the 80s, pretty much anywhere in the world, you had the same 80s. You know, y'all grew up watching Sesame Street. You know, you end up watching Dallas Dynasty or Falcon Crest or Knight Rider.
His mom was a policewoman. His dad was also a cop who became a lawyer. And Marlon spent most of his teenage life on his own.
You have 2 working parents, 2 cars. You pretty much raise yourself. For somebody like me, that means, you know, finding ways to sort of occupy my time and that restless kind of... I wouldn't know it was a creative spirit back then, but that's what it was. And, you know, channeling it through just tons of books and reading books and lots of comics and eventually being curious about stories that I started to try to write them. I mean, I wish I could tell you about the 80s. I spent most of it in my bedroom. So, and, you know, and yes, but that was a sort of the genesis to, you know, that writing life.
He had what he considered to be a colonial education, typical of many West Indian children of the era, that had little to do with his own life.
You know, by the time I was like 13, I don't think I read a single book where somebody who looked like me was in it. A huge part of our education is to train us to be British. And it's not even a real Britain, it's a colonial Britain. And it's in everything. It's one way in which Caribbean people talk English. You know, you only have to go to England to realize that the English you learned is what the butler speaks. So there is all of this sort of unlearning I didn't know I have to do.
It was not until much later that he learned that people like him, West Indian people, non-white people, did appear in books.
The first time I came across The Year in San Fernando, that was a shock. I didn't know there were novels with black people on the cover. And you open the book and it's a story about a black kid. You know, the hills were joyful together and the games are coming. Man, Michael Anthony, I think I only read him.
And then another realization, that the West Indian vernacular, the voices of his friends and relatives could be used to write an entire book from start to finish.
But then I'd read a book like Olive Senior's Summer Lightning, and I didn't know that there is a type of writing that I'd want to aspire to. And that book, that collection, was hugely inspiring. That Olive Senior's Summer Lightning, Earl Lovelace, The Dragon Can Dance, novels that not only were about people like me, but sounded like me. The idea that my voice could be the voice of literature just wouldn't have occurred to me. For a Caribbean reader, for a Caribbean writer, it was still kind of an electric shock to see it and to read it and to know that the voice coming out of my own mouth could be the voice of literature.
So far, Marlon was only reading fiction, some of it Caribbean literature with Caribbean voices, the authentic vernacular of our aunts and fathers. He was writing in a way, but it wasn't the kind of writing he aspired to.
Before I started writing fiction, I was a writer. I'd write commercials, and I was in advertising, and I was in public relations, and so on. It means I was doing a lot of writing for other people. I was doing a lot of writing by committee. I was doing a lot of writing honestly to pay the rent.
But then he began to express the ideas that sprang from his imagination, writing a manuscript about a community of Jamaican churchgoers grappling with good and evil.
My first novel, I didn't even write it to publish it, which might be why it took so long to get published. I wrote it because I wanted some aspect of writing or some aspect of creativity that was just mine. And that's really why I went back into it, to write something that I wasn't about to bid off, or write something I was gonna sell to the highest bidder, and something that I could keep for myself. Needless to say, I got to the point where I felt that I had a story, and a story that I wanted to be published. I think when I was writing it, I didn't think about it, but then when you finish a book, you're like, well, what do I do with it? And I just thought, well, I'll just send it out to publishers.
And here came a long period of submitting a manuscript titled John Crow's Devil to publishers. It was a young man's dream, and he soon came tumbling back to earth.
I was just really, really naive, and I'm like, you know what, I'll just write a query letter, print out 6 and send 6 out. And that's what I did for a while. I figured, I'm gonna submit a query letter, I'm gonna get an agent, they're gonna publish it, they're gonna give me a multi-million-dollar deal, Oprah is gonna call, I'm gonna tell her no. And I had the whole thing set out. Of course, I didn't get nobody responded to those letters. And that's fine. You learn pretty early that rejection is a fact of it.
Despite his earnest efforts, the manuscript was going nowhere. And then, a rejection that stung more than the others.
And the card from the publisher that shall remain nameless, Soho House, just sent a card that said, not for us. And for some reason, the finality of that, in a lot of ways, the brutality of that really hit. I think I'd rather they have not said anything. It just was, somebody took the time to go, not for us. And that was the first time I thought, well, how many of these have I sent out? Because it never occurred to me to check. And that was when, you go into my computer and look at how many of these forms I sent out, because I saved them, and it was 78. And that was a pretty devastating figure and a pretty devastating day.
In fact, it was so devastating that he didn't even want to see the manuscript anymore.
After all that rejection, I actually did give up on being a writer. I'd already thrown away that manuscript. I actually burnt it. It was very euphoric.
Though Marlon lives and teaches at university in the United States today, the awards committee notes that he retains a strong tether to the Caribbean through numerous workshops and presentations. In fact, it was the Calabash Literary Festival in Kingston and workshop moderator novelist Kaylee Jones who reignited his literary ambition.
Honestly, if Kaylee Jones hadn't insisted on me finding that manuscript to give to her, I don't think we'd be here right now. She read some of my writing and kind of insisted on seeing what I've written. And I destroyed that manuscript. I'm like, I'm not a writer. I don't have a book. And it was friends of mine in the workshop who told her he wrote a book, he just doesn't want to show it to you. And I'm thinking, nah, I know it's not that I don't want to show it to you, it's that I destroyed the damn thing. I don't have no damn book.
My name is Justine Hensel. I am one of the co-founders of the Calabash International Literary Festival here in Jamaica, along with Kwame Dawes and Colin Channel. Marlon impressed Kylie right off. And she kept saying to him, you have a manuscript. And he kept saying no. And she kept insisting, you have a manuscript. And finally he confessed that yes, he had a manuscript, but he had destroyed all copies. He had nothing. He wiped it from his hard drive. There was nothing. Kylie, being the incredibly smart woman she is, said, no, you emailed it to somebody. You sent it to your best friend.
So he had to scour his laptop, searching for the file in his email outbox.
I remember trying to print it out. I didn't have enough pages to print it, so I just cut the first 20 pages and the last 20 pages and printed it out and gave it to her, and she loved it, and she sent it to her publisher, which was Akashic Books, an independent press, and they loved it. And that's how my first novel got published.
Marlon was now up and running with John Crow's Devil, followed by The Book of Night Woman, the story of a slave on a Jamaican plantation. But it was a book partly imagined, partly historical, about the life and death of the most famous reggae artist ever to have lived, that really vaulted the author into the literary spotlight.
You collapse in Pittsburgh. It's never a good thing hearing doctors talk using a word that ends with Oma. Where's that coming from now? I mean, it is Culture Yard. You know, nobody talks about a quiet moment at Culture Yard.
Trenchtown was Bob Marley's home at one point, and his life and career are commemorated at the Trenchtown Culture Yard, where Marlon is reading an excerpt from a brief history of 7 killings. The reading describes the singer's cancer and his eventual death.
The Oma is hop, skip, and jump from your foot to your liver, lungs, and brain. In Manhattan, they blast you with radium and your locks drop and scatter.
A Brief History won the Booker Prize in 2015, and since then, Marlon James has been internationally recognized, which means that everyone wants to talk to him, sometimes in interesting places.
It's funny, the week before the Booker, I wrote this huge, vicious post about David Cameron, the Prime Minister, which nobody noticed, thank God. But right after that, almost every time I post something on Facebook, it became a headline. You know, it got to the point where I think in India, I was in the tabloid press. Actually, that was kind of cool.
Marlon now had a platform to express his views on all sorts of topics and causes, from his thoughts about the need for diversity in The Lord of the Rings to racism and police brutality in America.
I live in Minneapolis for 15 years, and my house was, let's see, I'm on essentially 30. So George Floyd was killed 7 blocks from my house. So when I say it could have been me, I'm not saying it for dramatic effect. I know that neighborhood, and I could have easily gone into that store not knowing I had counterfeit cash, and you'd be talking to some other writer about me when I was alive. It could happen, and I think the activism doesn't come necessarily just because I picked a cause. It comes because those things are so near to me, and so the proximity is so near. It's you know, it doesn't matter how much acclaim or whatever fame you can get, you can still walk out the street and be killed by a cop.
Marlon's second novel, The Book of Night Woman, is written entirely in Jamaican patois. To the reader, it seems natural that that should be the protagonist's voice. But the first publisher to come across the manuscript actually asked him to rewrite the entire book in standard English. And even the author had his doubts.
And I remember having this sort of internal fight because I'm writing this character and this character is talking Jamaican patois. And I'm like, but that's not literature, I can't write it that way. And almost for a few, at least 100 pages, every page I wrote in patois, I wrote a side one in so-called English.
The fact that Marlon writes in Jamaican English or patois is important, but he was not the first. You know, we have Louise Bennett, who is a national icon in Jamaica because she really pioneered the use of Jamaican English in literature in poetry. She made it acceptable for us to speak in our own language. So Marlon was continuing in that tradition of making sure that his characters spoke authentically.
Part of his process was going back to novels written in the African American vernacular, books like The Color Purple. And there he found the permission to write in the language of everyday people. In his books, you can find the dialect of the streets standing beside the standard English of his colonial education.
In New York City and in Kingston, both skies blazing bright with noon white, thunder breaks out and a lightning bolt slashes through the clouds. Summer lightning 3 months too early. The woman waking up in Manhattan and the woman sitting on the porch in Kingston, they both know you're gone.
Marlon is now on to writing fantasy, a trilogy set in a world of mythological African-inspired characters. It seems his genre is always changing. At one point he's labeled as a writer of historical fiction, now he's a fantasy writer. But Caribbean novelist is a title he wholeheartedly claims.
One, because the bulk of my work is still set in the Caribbean. Even the novels I write that are a fantasy version of Africa, it's a Caribbean perspective, it's a Jamaican perspective that goes into that. And it's a huge part of that identity. I think, I don't think a person saying he's a Swedish novelist thinks he's limiting himself. I am absolutely a Jamaican novelist and definitely a Caribbean novelist. I mean, why wouldn't you want to claim this?
There are many boxes, but I'd prefer to think of him as not being categorized because his work is enjoyed by Caribbean readers, but not only Caribbean readers. And I think we've got to the point where we need to stop trying to pigeonhole anybody into this is what they are. Marlon's ability to dip in and out of language, to dip in and out of different worlds, make him an exceptional writer who happens to come from Jamaica, who comes from the Caribbean.
The Anthony N. Sabga Awards Committee has hailed Marlon James as a literary mastermind. He says that the financial support that comes with the award is significant to any artist.
Never underestimate when people give you the resources to be a writer, or when people give you the resources to be an artist, especially in the Caribbean. Because all of us know the struggles. We know the struggles of if you're an actor, you're an insurance agent who does acting. If you're a writer, you're a such and such who does writing, and that's fine. But any opportunity that the Caribbean and this wonderful award, the SAGMA Awards, offers to have people be more of who they're being awarded for or what they're being awarded for, I think is great. There is also the getting recognized in your own country, in your own territory, in your own region, and among your own people, because we are the people I write about.
The ANSA Awards have highlighted many people in different categories over the years, and it is very special when you get that kind of recognition and the ability to go to King's House, have that kind of ceremony. We like to pretend perhaps that the accolades don't matter. I think they do matter because it also gives other people something to aspire to.
What's also important is recognizing a lot of us as we're still, I don't want to say mid-career, but that we still have a lot that we want to do and we plan to do. And I think that sort of recognition for people in progress is important as well. When people tell me they read my stuff and feel seen, it can be as good, if not greater than any awards, but I'll take the awards. You wake up burning. The mattress has sucked 2 pounds of water from your skin, but you can hear the air conditioner humming somewhere near you. You think of the pain on the right side of your head and it's there. Now you wonder if the pain is just a thought until you thought about it.
In June, Marlon was working on the set of Get Millie Black, an HBO series inspired by his mother's time in the Jamaica Constabulary.
My mom was one of the first Jamaican women cops to make detective. But this is not based on her. Sorry, Shirley James. doesn't matter. She keep telling people it's based on her. She clearly is a huge influence on it, being a Jamaican woman detective. And growing up with a detective is pretty interesting.
It was a surprise to Marlon that the show got produced. He didn't think the producers would bite at such a Jamaican story.
Well, right now I'm in Jamaica to, produce this show, to produce Get Millie Black, which started out as this sort of treatment I wrote on a napkin somewhere in LA. Honestly, to get rid of the people. 'Cause I'm like, it's a Jamaican show with a Jamaican protagonist and people speaking patois. And I'm thinking all these things that would make people go, oh, maybe not. Well, the world has changed, clearly, because now we're here shooting it, and we're shooting a very Jamaican show of people being very Jamaican. And it's fantastic.
What will Marlon James write next? He owes one more book in his fantasy trilogy. But after that,
I'm a big believer that the story that's in your head is the one that should come down on the page. And when you are, for whatever reason, if black, queer, woman, minority, whatever, all the sort of noise that we bring to the table before we even decide to express ourselves, all that noise that we have to sort of quiet to write. I think I've gotten to the point where I do that. So it really is pretty open. It is honestly whatever I want to write next.
Marlon received his Anthony N. Sabga Award Caribbean Excellence and funding to support his career at a black tie event in Kingston in July. Here are some excerpts of the speeches and remarks.
The Anthony N. Sabga Awards is the first program of its kind in the Caribbean. 4 prizes are awarded annually for achievements in arts and letters, entrepreneurship, public and civic contributions, and science and technology. The philosophy behind the awards is that in order for the Caribbean to develop in the sense of a civilization rather than an industrial center, excellence in key fields of endeavor must be sought out, rewarded, and promoted for the benefit of all citizens.
Now, the Regional Eminent Persons Panel convenes every year to receive oral and video presentations on the nominees from the country-nominated committees and to discuss the merits of the respective candidates. I can tell you that the process is very thorough and sometimes very exhausting, certainly very detailed. There are so many truly worthy nominees for consideration that in the final analysis, it is a matter of fine judgment.
It is so meaningful to be recognized in basically my own house. There is a sort of a Caribbean cliche about people getting acclaim abroad, and that has happened, of course, for those of you who've read the bio. But awards come with the legacies of their names. And it's a fantastic legacy that Anthony Sabga is leaving behind. One of Pan-Caribbeanism, which for a lot of us, certainly writers and artists in Jamaica, that we have been sometimes slow to adopt. Sometimes I jokingly call Jamaica the Texas of the Caribbean, in the sense that we have fully formed Jamaican sensibilities, but we're still kind of working on a Caribbean one. And I think the great thing about visionaries like Anthony Sabga is that he saw the future before us, and the future is us sort of working together and appreciating the talents that we have in the Caribbean. One of the problems with foreign awards, and I say that as somebody who's won a few of them, is that when you win a foreign award, foreign likes to take credit for you being award worthy. Usually whenever I'm on stage, if it's something to do with the Booker Prize, sometimes it's not even asked, it's just assumed, which British college did I go to? Or which foreign high school did I go to? And I go Wilmer's Boys in Kingston. And I go, which foreign college? I go, University of the West Indies, but they do have a foreign campus in St. Augustine, if that's what you're asking. The point being that my literary and historical sensibilities were already formed here. Because because of fantastic teachers, most of whom I remember by name. I still remember Daphne Chin, who hit upon this radical idea to teach basic school, the primary school syllabus. I don't recommend it. But it did make me a genius for 7 years in the next school I went to. Thank you so much for shining a light on Caribbean literature and Caribbean arts and Caribbean excellence. And I really hope that this is, a sign, or at least the beginning of a greater sort of Caribbean identity and a greater sort of a Caribbean relationship. And as we sort of, we move forward, slightly uncertain time, but we have our writers and we have our artists and our scientists and our musicians to guide the way, and I hope we continue to do so.
Our final episode focuses on virologist Christine Carrington, who recently received a national award for her work during the pandemic. We hope you'll be viewing the story of a young woman who was fascinated by viruses long before she became a crucial part of the Caribbean response to the COVID pandemic.